Funny, there's a heart on the floor. Moment of love made real in the world. It's an old story, and maybe one you know. In the Hebrew Bible, there is a tale of a man named Job. Now, Job is a great guy in this book. He's a husband and father, a successful landowner, a devoted follower of God. But to make a long story short, his life takes a sharp turn for the worse, and it gets bad. His kids are killed, his livestock is destroyed, he ends up with an awful disease that causes him to curse the very day he was born. And at the worst time in his life, Job has 3 friends who come over to comfort him. They tell him it must be his fault in some way. He must have done something. He must have sinned in order to deserve this punishment. Job tells his friends they are terrible comforters. Well, there's a lot more to unpack with the story of Job. We're going to save that for a different sermon because I want to stop right there. Horrible things happened to him. He had lost so much, and his friends were trying to help by telling him he must have deserved it in some way, that he needed to make up for what he did in order to get out of what was obviously punishment. Now, in Job's case, as some of you know, he hadn't actually done anything wrong, but I don't think that really matters when we think about this story's implications for our own lives today. I want us to think about his friends' reactions when they saw Job suffering, seemingly being punished in life. How many of us might play the role of Job's friends in this story? We hear of a person experiencing hardship, experiencing punishment, and we might assume it's just. We assume we live in a fair world, so their suffering must be deserved. For example, in our society, when someone is arrested or when another black man is shot by police, it's easy for people to say, well, I wonder what they did wrong, or how they somehow caused this bad event to happen, or possibly deserved it. They shouldn't have been in that area. They shouldn't have run. They shouldn't have hid. Doing this allows us to have a sense of control over our own lives. If bad things only happen when we do something to deserve it, we have the ability to keep ourselves safe as long as we never, ever do anything wrong. And while it makes some sense that we would think this way, that we would take these protective steps, it has led us to a situation today where we have a criminal justice system that is based on punishment. We have come to equate justice with suffering. We see this in the way people react anytime there is talk of criminal justice reform. We see this when there's talk of improving the conditions of prisons or giving prisoners better educational or legal access. And it's easy to find people saying that they don't deserve better access to education or medicine or adequate living conditions, certainly not before we address this or this or this. We are part of a society that has decided that punishment is the best way to deal with people. We assume a strong system of punishments is necessary to control human impulses. Our president and leaders and other leaders have justified separating immigrant parents and children using the logic, well, if they didn't want their children taken from them, they shouldn't have come here that way. Even when it comes to our own citizens, we will keep people in jail for years, awaiting a trial if they can't afford bail, effectively punishing people for being poor. And once again, many of us protect ourselves from the fear that we could get caught up in the system by deciding that whatever happens to the person in prison must be deserved. How many times have we heard people balk at doing away with the bail system, the money bail system, by saying, well, if you don't have money for bail, just don't do anything to get yourself arrested. As a culture, we believe suffering must naturally and rightly flow from wrongdoing. Is it any wonder that in our own lives, when we've made a mistake, when we've hurt someone, we often seek to punish ourselves with guilt, with shame? Underlying all of this is that subtle belief in redemptive suffering, which is the theological idea that human suffering is necessary to restore sinful people to right relationship with God and one another. Some Christian groups teach this, but even if a person doesn't consider themselves Christian or comes from a Christian tradition that rejects the idea of redemptive suffering has so permeated our culture, it may have become part of their embedded theology, which are the default assumptions about spiritual matters. And yet, redemptive suffering is not the only approach we have for creating a just, healthy world. A different way is possible. We can choose a different system in our society and in our lives, one focused on restoring right relationships without relying on suffering. I want to spend some time telling you about the restorative justice process at a larger level before we can talk about how it can be applied to our own lives and our own smaller communities. How many of you are familiar with restorative justice? So a few of you, and some of you a little bit. Restorative justice is a system of justice that seeks accountability rather than punishment. It's a system that looks at repairing the harm caused by the behavior as much as possible. Whether in schools or courts, when harm is done, all the individuals impacted by the action choose whether they will participate in the restorative process, both those who were harmed and those who caused the harm. If everyone chooses to participate, then in many programs they meet together. Everyone has an opportunity to talk and to share their experience of the event. The victim can get some answers for those hard questions about what happened and why, and knows they will be seen and heard in the process, something that rarely happens in a traditional criminal justice approach. The person who did the harm hears from the victim and comes to a better understanding of the impact of their actions. Both groups discuss the situation, and specific actions are requested to work to repair the actual harm done. This gives the victim and the individual an opportunity to come to some sort of resolution with one another. Before we move on, I want to share with you one of many stories out there from this type of program. While this story is about a youth in the criminal justice system, restorative justice programs have been used in schools and adult courts as well. Do keep in mind that one caution about this type of program is that it can be set up poorly by people who are not sufficiently trained. In these cases, it can do more harm than good. But let's hear about this one program and think about how we can apply this type of repairing cracks to our own lives. On the night of May 15th, John Smith and Bob Jones, both 15-year-old white males, broke into a home in their community and stole several $100s worth of property. The stolen items included about $75 in cash, a bicycle, a CD player, a radio, a tape player, and tapes, and sports jacket belonging to the teenage son who lived in the home. They also broke a screen and a window in the house, spray painted on an outside wall, and knocked over the trash. They were later questioned and arrested for the break-in and theft when another youth at school thought he recognized the jacket that his friend had said was stolen. Both boys were processed and brought before the juvenile court where they were adjudicated delinquent. Springfield's juvenile justice system was engaged in trying a new approach for working with nonviolent delinquent youth. Youth were randomly assigned to traditional corrections programs or the new program approach. So this is the story of Bob, who was assigned to the restorative justice program. And this story comes from the Conflict Resolution Center. Bob was sentenced to probation, but his probation officer approached the case differently. She had received special training in restorative justice. She held a meeting that was attended by everyone who had an interest in the case: Bob and his parents, the family whose home was robbed, and a panel of 6 persons, 3 youth and 3 adults came. The probation officer asked members of the family whose home was robbed to describe how the crime affected them. The son said he had not been able to keep his paper route because he lost his bicycle, and without it, he couldn't earn money to replace the other stolen items. The mother of the family said she had been afraid when she was home alone since the break-in occurred. The father said he was angry about the damage done to his property. Next, Bob told the group why he had done the crime. He said he and John wanted to go to a concert but didn't have the money. They knew the youth living in the house had a paper route and earned money. They planned to steal enough to buy tickets, but when they found the other items, they decided to steal them as well. Bob's parents spoke, saying they were disappointed that their son had done this. They said they had already grounded him from playing ball. An adult community member said such crimes in the neighborhood made her and her friends nervous to be alone. A gentleman said he was concerned that vandalism and graffiti would make the area look appealing to other criminals. A youth said she felt the actions of the two boys reflected badly on all teenagers, giving them all a bad reputation, even when they hadn't done anything wrong. At the end of the meeting, the probation officer asked everyone to give their ideas about what could be done to repair the harm and make amends for the crime. First, she asked Bob to say what he thought he should do. Bob said he thought he should get a job and repay the money, but he didn't know where he could get hired. One of the community members at the conference said he would hire Bob to sweep out his store and do other jobs every day after school. Bob's dad said he thought that he and Bob should go repair the window and screen and repaint the damaged wall. He said he would withhold Bob's allowance until the materials were paid for. One of the community youth suggested Bob should also help the teen center's home repair project. They will spend Saturdays helping older residents in the community with lawn care and upkeep. An adult from the community said he thought Bob should write a letter of apology to the family he had robbed. The probation officer said she wanted Bob to attend a group session with other youth in which they would work on pro-social attitudes, values, and behaviors. Bob agreed to each of these requests. That's important. Bob agreed to each of these requests and completed each part of his obligation. He worked in the store of the community member from the committee after school until he repaid the $200 he owed. He and his dad repaired the damage to the victim's home. He helped with the youth home repair project and made a couple of new friends. Later, he continued to help with home repairs and spent time with his new friends after school. Other teens and adults who knew Bob said they felt comfortable with him and thought he was trying to act appropriately. Bob wrote a letter of apology to the family he robbed. He worked on it for several weeks before the probation officer said it was okay, and then he sent it to the victims. Bob also attended group sessions regularly and often shared mature insights into pro-social values and behaviors based on his other experiences in the justice system. When Bob's year on probation ended, the probation officer held a closing conference with all the persons who had been at the first one. She summarized what Bob had accomplished. She asked each person to say what he or she thought about that and about the approach she had taken. The victims said they felt Bob had repaid them in money and in work for the losses they experienced. The community members said they felt Bob was a credit to the community and had made an important contribution through his help with the home repair project. His parents said they thought the process had been fair, and they felt Bob was more mature because of it. Bob said he learned a lot. He gained many skills from his job and his volunteer work. He had legitimate ways to earn money. He made new friends, and he thought about things differently now. This is just one example of the restorative process, but I want to draw your attention to a few points. First, at no time was the focus on punishing Bob and making him suffer. His suffering was not the path to redemption. Instead, all involved sought ways that the suffering could be reduced and the harm could be repaired. The needs of those who were harmed were not ignored, but justice was not focused on seeing Bob harmed in return. This program treated everyone involved, including Bob, as though they had inherent worth and dignity. It offered him a chance to repair some of the relationships he had damaged and restore some of his own sense of self-worth. It allowed him to hear about the wider impact of his actions, and it allowed him, the impacted, to be heard and to share what they needed. Rather than punishing him in a way that offers little opportunity for growth or healing on any side, Bob was offered an opportunity. These programs bring us closer to the goal of a world community of peace, liberty, and justice for all, the sixth principle of Unitarian Universalism. So let's back up and bring this idea back into our personal lives or our lives together in this church. What might a restorative approach offer us for repairing the cracks in our own relationships? Restorative approaches are not limited to formal programs. When we've messed up with another person, when we felt harmed by another person, how can we repair those relationships and rebuild the trust? I would suggest first that we reach out. If you've been hurt by something, you may need to talk to someone else before you talk to the person who caused it. You may need some support to go to the person and talk about the situation. If you need support to talk to someone here at the church, you can first come to me or a member of the Committee on Ministry, which is Lynn, Gretchen, and Nina. If you're not ready or able to talk to the person, or you are in a toxic or abusive relationship, that is not the process to take right now. Certainly not without a lot more support and someone who is more specifically trained. It shows a lot of trust in someone to come to them and tell them you've been hurt and what you might need. And it shows a lot of trust and courage to be on the other side of that conversation. It hurts when we find out we've hurt someone else. And to be able to hear about the harm that was done, remain non-defensive, and take steps to repair the relationship is a sign of spiritual maturity. You also can ask for support. And what about when we are sure we've caused harm, but that person hasn't reached out to us? That was the point of our reading today when Reverend Rebecca Savage talked about the shame she felt around not calling her friend. Eventually, she faced the anxiety and shame and called her friend anyway, deciding to apologize in the one moment that her friend most needed her. Admitting when we have done harm and reaching out to restore that relationship is one of the hardest things we have to do in life. I won't ask you to raise your hands, but how many of you have allowed a friendship to deteriorate or disappear because you made a mistake? And faced with anxiety and shame, you haven't been able to reach out. You haven't been able to take steps to restore the relationship. I know I have. And maybe it's time to take that next step together. I promise you that I will be doing so this week. I will reach out to someone that I've been anxious about because I haven't reached out when I should have. So if you reach out to someone this week too, you know that you aren't doing it alone. My beloved spiritual companions, to be human is to know that you will be hurt by others and you will hurt others. Our ancient tendency to want to address harm with harm, to link wrongdoing and punishment in the name of justice can no longer protect us. If we can trust one another, if we value the relationships we have with one another, let us take a step into restoring our relationships. Let us work to repair the cracks. May it be so. Amen.